What if the most powerful force shaping your entire life is something you have been unconsciously avoiding? What if the reason your reality keeps repeating the same emotional patterns, the same frustrations, the same types of people, the same internal conflicts, has nothing to do with what you are doing, but with something that happens before you do anything at all? Let me ask you something. When everything around you becomes quiet, when there is no music, no conversation, no distraction, no scrolling, no external stimulation, what happens inside you? Do you feel calm, or do you feel an urge to escape that stillness? Why does silence make so many people uncomfortable? Why do we rush to fill it? Why do we turn on sound, open another app, search for noise, create conversation, just to avoid that space? What is hiding inside silence? And more importantly, why have we never been taught to understand it? Because here is something most people never realize. Silence is not empty. Silence is not passive. Silence is not the absence of something. Silence is a presence, a field, a container, a space where structure has not yet solidified. Before every decision you have ever made, there was a silent moment. Before every reaction, there was a gap. Before every identity, there was awareness. And that awareness was silent, but you moved too fast to notice it. You identify with the thought before you notice what came before it. You identify with the emotion before you notice what allowed it to arise. You identify with the reaction before you notice the space that made reaction possible. And that space, that silent fraction, that invisible pause, is where your reality begins forming. Not when you act, not when you speak, not when you decide, but when perception starts organizing itself. Most people believe that reality is something that happens to them. They believe that circumstances shape identity, that environment shapes reaction, that other people determine emotional state. But what if reality is organizing itself around something far more subtle? What if it organizes itself around your internal state before thought, before narrative, before logic? There is a level of awareness that does not speak, it does not explain, it does not justify, it simply exists. And from that level, perception is structured. Imagine for a moment that reality is not a fixed object, but a dynamic field. A field of possibilities waiting for interpretation, waiting for organization, waiting for collapse into form. Now ask yourself this. What determines which possibility becomes your experience? Is it luck? Is it external force? Is it destiny? Or is it something happening internally before you are even aware of it? There is a silent layer beneath your thoughts, beneath your beliefs, beneath your emotional reactions. And that layer is constantly shaping how you perceive, how you interpret, how you respond, and how reality reorganizes around you. But because it is silent, you overlook it. You focus on what is loud. You focus on visible problems, on external conflict, on surface behavior, and you never explore the source, the silent source. Here is the open question that most people never ask themselves. If silence is the foundation of every thought, every emotion, every action, then what is happening inside your silence? Is it calm, or is it tension? Is it openness, or is it fear? Is it presence, or is it constant background noise? Because even when you are not speaking, your mind is speaking. Even when you are not acting, your identity is projecting. Even when you are not reacting, your subconscious is organizing patterns. And all of that happens in silence, not visible, not audible, but active. So here is the deeper layer. If your inner silence is filled with unresolved tension, if it is filled with subtle fear, if it is filled with lack or comparison or quiet anxiety, then the field of possibility is being filtered through that state, and reality will reflect it. Not because reality is punishing you, but because perception is organizing it. Silence is not nothing. Silence is the blueprint phase. It is the pre-structure. It is the unseen architecture. And if you never examine it, you will keep trying to change the building without ever adjusting the foundation. Now pause for a moment. Right now, notice the silence between these words. Notice the awareness that is reading this. Before interpretation, before agreement, before resistance. There is a witnessing, quiet, unlabeled, present. That witnessing is closer to reality than your thoughts about reality. And if you learn to enter that silence consciously, you stop reacting to a finished world, and begin influencing a forming one. But this requires something most people are not willing to face. It requires staying in silence long enough to see what is actually there. And most people leave too quickly. They escape before insight appears. They distract before awareness deepens. They move before perception reorganizes. So the question becomes, are you willing to remain in silence long enough to see how your reality is being shaped? Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand where reality begins, you stop trying to control outcomes and start working at the level where outcomes are born. Stay with me, because this is only the beginning. In the next part, we will go deeper into what silence actually does to identity, to subconscious pattern, and to the field of possibility itself. If silence is the invisible foundation of every thought, every emotion, every action, then we need to understand what is truly happening inside it, because silence is not merely a psychological state, it is structural. Imagine that reality is not solid, but a field of probabilities, a field of possibilities, a field that has not yet decided what form to take. Modern science suggests something curious. At its most fundamental level, matter does not behave like a fixed object. It behaves like potential, like a wave, like something that exists in possibility, until interaction occurs, until observation happens, and then what was potential collapses into form. But here is the question almost no one asks: what influences that collapse? What influences which version of reality becomes your experience? You may say circumstance, you may say environment, you may say destiny, but before circumstance there is perception, before environment there is interpretation, before event there is internal state, and that state does not begin with thought, it begins before it, in the silent field where memory, identity, expectation already exist, even if you do not notice. Your subconscious is not neutral, it projects, it anticipates, it filters, it organizes, it selects, it decides what feels real, before conscious thought appears. So when something happens, you may not be seeing what happened, you may be seeing what your internal state allowed you to perceive. And this changes everything, because if your silence is filled with unresolved fear, with subtle insecurity, with the need for control, with quiet scarcity, then the field of possibility is being observed through that state. And when possibility collapses, it collapses coherently with that state. Not because the universe is against you, but because perception organizes experience. Identity is noise, memory is noise, personal narrative is noise. All of it interferes, all of it directs, all of it compresses the field. And when the field is compressed, possibility narrows. Now observe something simple. When you are anxious, how does the world feel? More threatening, more urgent, more unstable. When you are calm, how does the world feel? More open, more fluid, more possible. Did the world change, or did the state change? This is the point. True silence is not relaxation. It is perceptual neutrality. It is the absence of interference. It is observation without projection. And when observation does not project, it allows, it does not force, it does not distort, it does not contract, it simply witnesses. And in that clean witnessing, the field remains open, wider possibilities can emerge. But there is something even deeper here, because when you enter true silence, identity begins to lose strength, narrative begins to dissolve. The character you believe yourself to be starts weakening, and that can feel uncomfortable. Because if you are not your thoughts, if you are not your emotions, if you are not your history, then who observes, who is present, who is aware? Perhaps silence is not merely a state. Perhaps it is the foundation of what you truly are. And if that is true, then we are not speaking about relaxation. We are speaking about deep reorganization, because silence does not merely calm, it realigns, it reorganizes, it reshapes the way reality structures itself. And when that begins to happen, you start to notice something subtle. Reality is not as fixed as it appeared. It responds, it adjusts, it organizes around state. And this leads us to an even subtler layer, because silence does not only influence what you perceive, it begins to dissolve what you believed you were. And when that happens, something shifts at the deepest level of experience, not from outside inward, but from inside outward. And this is where everything quietly begins to transform. If silence reorganizes the way reality structures itself, then we must look at what interferes with that silence: identity, because identity is not just who you think you are. Identity is a collection of memories, interpretations, conclusions you formed about yourself and about the world. When something happened in your childhood and you felt fear, your body recorded it. When you were rejected and felt pain, your system learned. When you failed and felt shame, a narrative began forming. And that narrative did not disappear. It became part of your inner silence. Even when you are not thinking about it, it is there, influencing how you perceive, how you react, how you anticipate. You believe you are choosing, but often you are repeating. Repeating emotional patterns. Repeating relationship dynamics. Repeating expectations. Repeating interpretations of reality. And all of this happens in silence. Before action, before decision, before conscious awareness. The subconscious does not work with intention, it works with familiarity. It seeks coherence, it seeks what it already knows, even if what it knows is uncomfortable. because what is familiar feels safe. So you may say, I want to change. But if your silent identity is still rooted in fear, your perceptual field will continue filtering possibilities coherent with fear. And here is the delicate point. You are not creating your reality only through conscious thought. You are creating through the silent state that sustains those thoughts. If that state is filled with a limited self-image, reality organizes limited. If that state is filled with doubt, reality organizes uncertain. If that state is filled with tension, reality organizes defensive. Now observe something profound. You do not need to change the world. You need to clear the silence, because when silence stops carrying rigid identity, something begins to happen. Patterns weaken, reactions slow down. The space between stimulus and response expands, and in that expanded space, you begin to experience something new, real choice. Not automatic reaction, but choice. Silence interrupts automation. It creates a crack in repetition. And when repetition weakens, reality stops being predictable, because it is no longer filtered through the same noise. Perhaps you have experienced this. Rare moments when you were deeply present, and everything felt different, not because the world changed, but because you were less identified, less reactive, more silent. In those moments, possibility feels larger, responses feel clearer, decisions feel aligned. That is not coincidence, it is coherence. When silence is clear, perception is clear. When perception is clear, reality reorganizes. But here is the deeper layer. When you remain in silence long enough, identity begins to reveal what it truly is. Not something fixed, but something constructed, something learned, something conditioned. And when you see that identity is constructed, it loses control. You begin to see thought as thought, emotion as emotion, memory as memory, and something more fundamental remains: presence, awareness, pure observation. And from that observation, reality is no longer repetition, it becomes possibility. But this requires stability, because true silence is uncomfortable at first. It exposes, it reveals, it dismantles, and many people leave before reorganization occurs. But when you remain, something shifts structurally. You stop being the reactive character and begin becoming the space where experience unfolds. And when that happens, the way the world responds begins to change. Not magically, but coherently, because the field is no longer compressed by the same identity. And this leads to something even more essential, because if identity can dissolve, what remains? When the noise fades, when the pattern weakens, when the narrative loses power, what is left? Here silence stops being a tool and begins revealing nature, and when nature is revealed, your relationship with reality is never the same. When identity begins to dissolve, something unexpected happens. You begin to notice that something has always been there, something that never changed. While thoughts changed, while emotions came and went, while stories were created, something remained, silent, observing. This presence does not react, it does not defend, it does not project, it simply witnesses. And perhaps this is the true observer. Not the thought that comments, not the emotion that colors, but the presence that perceives. Now notice something essential. If there is a presence that observes thought, then you are not the thought. If there is a presence that observes emotion, then you are not the emotion. If there is a presence that observes identity, then identity is not you. This completely changes the structure of experience. Because until now, you believed you were the character. But perhaps, you are the space where the character appears and disappears. When this perception stabilizes, silence stops being effort. It becomes natural, not as a practice, but as recognition. Recognition that before any narrative, awareness already exists, and that awareness does not need to prove itself, does not need to compete, does not need to defend. It simply is, and when you rest at that level, something happens in the field. Tension decreases, the need to control weakens, the urgency to react slows down, and in place of contraction, openness appears. Now notice something deeper. When you are not trying to force reality, when you are not trying to manipulate circumstances, when you simply remain present, the field responds differently, because coherence changed, the state changed, observation changed, and when observation changes, organization changes. This does not mean everything becomes perfect. It means you stop fighting against the flow and begin moving with it. But here is the delicate point. Many confuse silence with passivity, but true silence is not absence of action. It is action without internal noise. It is decision without tension. It is movement without conflict. It is response without reactivity. When you act from silence, action becomes clearer, more precise, more aligned, because it does not arise from defense, from fear, from lack. It arises from presence. And presence does not fragment. It integrates. Now imagine living like this, not reacting automatically, but choosing from space. Not being dragged by pattern, but responding with awareness. This changes your relationship with time, with people, with challenges, with opportunities, because you are no longer acting from the character, you are acting from the observer. And when the observer stabilizes in silence, the field stops being a battle and becomes collaboration. But this leads to something even deeper. If you can recognize the presence that observes and remain in it, then what exactly is reality? Is it something external, or something emerging from the relationship between observation and field, between silence and form? Here experience begins to expand, because perhaps reality is not fixed, but constantly emerging from the way you are being, and when being shifts, what emerges shifts. This opens a door not to control the world, but to understand how you participate in it. And when participation becomes conscious, creation stops being unconscious and begins becoming intentional, quietly, naturally, without force. And perhaps true power was never in the noise. It was always in silence. There comes a moment when silence stops being a practice and begins revealing itself as essence. Not something you do, but something you are. When identity weakens, when patterns lose strength, when noise decreases, something remains. And what remains has no form, no history, no past. It is simply presence. And in that presence, there is something that was always there. Before fear, before comparison, before the need to prove, before the sense of separation. Perhaps what we call separation was never real. Perhaps it was only noise, interpretation, over-identification with thought. Because when you rest in deep silence, the feeling of me versus the world begins dissolving. You no longer feel isolated. You no longer feel disconnected. You feel part of something larger, not as belief, but as direct experience. And when that experience stabilizes, fear decreases. Not because the world became safer, but because you are no longer reacting from contraction. The field stops being a threat and becomes extension. Now notice something subtle. If you are not against the field, if you are not fighting the flow, if you are not trying to impose identity, what happens? There is less friction, less resistance, less effort. And when there is less effort, there is more clarity. And when there is more clarity, decisions become simpler. Life begins to feel lighter, not because challenges disappear, but because internal contraction no longer dominates. Deep silence is not escape from reality. It is direct encounter with it, without excessive filter, without defensive narrative, without dramatic interpretation. And when you meet reality without distortion, it stops appearing as enemy. Perhaps what you called obstacle was internal resistance. Perhaps what you called destiny was unconscious repetition. Perhaps what you called bad luck was filtered perception. And when the filter changes, experience changes. Not because the world obeys, but because coherence shifted. Now there is something even deeper. If silence reveals your original nature, then who were you before learning fear, before learning comparison, before learning limitation? This question is not philosophical, it is structural. Because the more you return to essential silence, the more you realize identity was only a layer. And when layers fall, something very simple remains. Awareness, presence, being. And when you live from that level, creation stops being effort and becomes consequence. Consequence of state, consequence of coherence, consequence of internal alignment. It is not about controlling the field, it is about not interfering with it. It is not about forcing reality, it is about allowing it to emerge. And perhaps true power is not in doing more, but in interfering less, speaking less, reacting less, resisting less. And in that less something greater appears. Something more intelligent, something more intelligent, something more natural. And here your relationship with reality transforms deeply. Because you stop trying to be the controller and begin being the conscious participant. And when participation becomes conscious, creation becomes inevitable. Quietly, without excessive effort, without internal conflict, without invisible war. And perhaps what you were searching for outside was always in the silence within. There comes a point when you realize you were never truly separate from reality. Separation was interpretation. It was thought. It was narrative. Because when silence becomes your foundation, you begin to notice the world is not against you. It is responding to state, responding to coherence, responding to the level of awareness you sustain. And this can feel uncomfortable, because it means you participate. Even when you do not notice, you participate in how you react, in how you interpret, in how you position yourself, in how you identify. But there is something liberating here. If you participate, you are not a victim. If you participate, you are not at mercy. If you participate, There is choice, not superficial choice, but structural choice, choice of state, choice of inner posture, choice to remain in silence or return to noise. And that choice happens many times a day. With every thought, with every emotion, with every impulse, you can react, or you can observe. You can contract, or expand. You can resist, or allow. The difference seems small, but it is structural, because when you observe before reacting, pattern loses strength. When you breathe before responding, repetition weakens. When you remain present in silence, reality reorganizes, perhaps not instantly, but inevitably, because internal coherence creates external coherence, not as magic, but as alignment, and the more you sustain that alignment, the more natural it becomes. No longer effort, no longer technique, no longer forced practice, simply your state. And when silence becomes state, you no longer need to convince the world, you no longer need to prove anything, you no longer need to chase. Things begin to flow with less friction because you are not creating invisible conflict. But here is something even deeper. Silence does not only change how you act, it changes how you perceive. And perception is the foundation of experience. If perception shifts, experience shifts. If experience shifts, perceived reality shifts. And perhaps this is the true meaning of creation, not creating something from nothing, but transforming the way the field organizes around your awareness. This is not fantasy, it is silent responsibility. And responsibility is not weight, it is power. Power to choose who you are before acting. Power to choose how you observe. Power to choose to remain in silence, even when the world invites noise. And here lies the great question. If you truly lived from silence, what would change in your life? Which decisions would be different? Which relationships would shift? Which patterns would dissolve? Which opportunities would appear? This question is not for immediate answer, it is for feeling, because the next step is not to understand more, it is to experience. And in the next moment, we cross the final layer, where silence and reality stop appearing as two, and reveal themselves as one. If you made it this far, perhaps something within you has already begun to notice. Silence is not absence, it is origin, it is not emptiness, it is field. It is not weakness, it is invisible strength. Perhaps you spent years trying to change your reality, changing strategies, changing environments, changing people, changing goals, but rarely changing your internal state, rarely changing the observer. And this is where everything reorganizes, because reality does not respond only to what you do, it responds to what you sustain. It responds to coherence between thought, emotion, presence, and when you sustain silence, without escape, without denial, without repression, but as foundation, as state, as center, the field begins to align, not by force, but by resonance. Perhaps you do not need to force more, perhaps you need to interfere less. Perhaps what you call a blockage is only internal noise. Perhaps what you call lack of results is misalignment. And perhaps what you have been searching for outside is simply the stability of silence within. There is something powerful in realizing this. Because the moment you understand you participate, you reclaim autonomy, not autonomy to control everything, but autonomy to choose how to be, how to observe, how to sustain state, and that changes everything. Not because the world obeys, but because the relationship shifts. And when the relationship shifts, experience shifts. And when experience shifts, perceived reality shifts. Silence is not passivity. Silence is alignment. Silence is presence. Silence is natural intelligence. And perhaps true power was never about doing more, but about being more aware, more present, reacting less, observing more. Now I want to ask you a simple question. If you could choose one word to represent the state you want to sustain, what would it be? Write in the comments one single word, the word that represents the state you choose to live. It could be silence, presence, clarity, coherence, calm, awareness. Choose one, write it, and notice how you feel as you claim it. If this reflection resonated, stay connected, because perhaps the next step is not doing more, but perceiving more. And in the next video, we will explore why your life seems to repeat itself, why even when you change people, places, decisions, you end up feeling the same emotions, living the same patterns, and how these invisible cycles are quietly shaping your reality. Grateful to have you here. Much light on your path.